Hello and welcome to this demonstration on how to use the dotCMS command line interface to manage all files and objects that are on your dotCMS instance, including committing those files to GitHub. Now, before we begin, however, let's review what we're going to cover during the session on the dotCLI. So first we're going to define what is the dotCLI. Then we're going to cover how to actually install the dotCLI and configure it to your server. We're going to define how to change workspaces and how workspaces are actually defined using the dotCLI, downloading and syncing objects using the dotCLI to seed the files and objects that can be handled through the dotCLI. Then we're going to configure the dotCLI with GitHub using GitHub workflow actions. Then we're going to test that CI/CD pipeline by adding and deleting objects using GitHub actions. So let's go ahead and begin with what is the dotCLI. I've got a terminal window open here to my left where I'm going to be committing files, downloading files to my local computer, and I'm going to right now define what is the dotCMS dotCLI for you. So let's just go ahead and search what is the dotCMS dotCLI and how I can install it. Let's ask AI, search through our dotCMS documents. And so it says here that the dotCMS command line interface is a standalone tool designed to interact with the dotCMS instance via a command shell. That's what we have over here on the left. Facilitating a variety of automated operations and behaviors, it is aligned with dotCMS versioning, sharing the same numbering scheme, although full backward compatibility with older versions cannot be guaranteed, so you do need to keep it updated. Now, what are these operations and behaviors that our AI search is talking about? Let's take a moment to define what the dotCMS command line interface is designed to manage. As we know, the dotCMS UI is built to allow users to effectively manage content. However, admins and developers want to build repeatable deployments and to use their favorite editors when writing code or configuring things like themes, templates, containers, widgets, languages, sites, and even content types. The dotCLI allows developers to manage such code and manage configuration objects locally, and then more importantly, to use Git to version control the code and configuration to make up a deployment. Doing this allows multiple developers to work simultaneously and to ensure repeatable deployments and visibility in changes to the code. Allowing developers to edit all the code and configuration objects outside the dotCMS UI is much more efficient and comfortable for web developers and allows code and configuration objects to be repeatedly deployed via the dotCLI to different environments. This is opposed to content, which within dotCMS should be authored and then promoted between servers using the dotCMS push publishing feature. So now that we have defined what the dotCLI is and what it's used for, let's now talk about how to install the dotCLI on a local computer. So the first thing we can glean from right here is this command, which I'm going to actually use to check my local install of the dotCLI and make sure it is up to date. However, if we look at the documentation link right here, which I actually have open up in this other window, you can see that there is a dotCMS cheat sheet for the dotCLI you could download right here on the top of the dotCLI documentation, and it gives you those same commands on how to install. So I'm going to bring up that cheat sheet. So let me just drag that little cheat sheet over here so we can actually copy those commands. So here, if I take my first command to do an npm install of the dotCMS.cli, I can go ahead and install it, and it'll check to see if my local install is actually of the latest version, and it does check, and I do have the latest version. If it didn't have the latest version of the dotCMS.cli, it would actually suggest the command that would update me to the latest version. The next command that needs to be run is the dotCLI config. Now what this will do will actually help you establish a connection to an existing server that you'd like to communicate with and manage the files on. So here I've got a server that I've created for a POC, and I'm going to use this URL in the config so I can actually establish a connection to manage the files that are on this server. So the next thing I'm going to do is run that config command. And then you can see that I've already got a profile. If I didn't have any profiles already set up for other servers, then I could just go ahead and press enter, and what it'll do is it'll ask if I want to add a new .cms instance. So I can say yes, I want to add another server that I want to communicate with and manage those files. So now I have to add a unique name to communicate with this exact server and this instance of .cms. So I am going to name it CHS, and I'm going to copy the URL for the host that I would like to manage using dotCLI. So I enter that into there, and it says, are these values okay? I say yes, and now I've got another repository. I do not want to add any other dotCLI connection, so I say no. Now I can choose which of these hosts I want to manage through the dotCLI. So I'll choose the number 1 and enter into that active profile. Now if I go back to my cheat sheet, so I do want to log in with this admin user, so I'll paste that command here and it'll ask me for my password. So I'm going to paste here in the password area the exact same password that I would actually use to log into the .cms instance. Press enter, and it's logging me in, and now I am successfully logged in and can manage the files on this particular instance. So the first thing I would like to do is pull all the files down. So I'm going to try a dotCLI pull, and here we'll look at the directory where I am right now in the dotCLI directory. Here I have it open, and let's go ahead and pull those files. And you can see here it's creating all of the folders and files. It's pulling them down for that exact .cms instance. And if I open up sites, we'll be able to see the sites that are actually there on the instance, the languages that are installed, the files, both live and working, and the content types are being pulled down to this particular area. And then I can manage all of those files here directly from my iMac, and then I can go ahead and commit changes to those files using the dotCLI. Okay, so that worked, and we pulled down all of our files, our content types, languages, files, sites, so we can see all of that information here. However, I realized that my GitHub repository was actually pulled down here, so I actually want to use the same directory where I have my GitHub repository actually already connected to GitHub. So this gives us an opportunity to talk about the workspace command. So what we're going to do is we're going to change directory over here in our command line. We don't want the content types and files and languages to be here. We want them to be inside the CHS directory, which is my GitHub repository named CHS here. So this is what we're going to commit to. So I'm going to change directory cd CHS, and now I'm going to run the workspace command. So if you do need to change directory for the dotCLI, you can just simply run the dotCLI pull workspace and then define the directory. You could do it here or define a different directory if you were outside that directory to point at the exact location where you already have your GitHub repo already connected to GitHub. You want them to try and be the same. So let's go ahead and run that command and pull again. So here we can see we've changed our workspace, and now we are inside the same directory where we have GitHub installed, ready to connect to this repository here. So now let's go ahead and commit those files using the dotCMS dotCLI integration with GitHub. So if we open up a new tab, we can see here in the documentation that we can use GitHub Actions to establish a integration for our CI/CD pipeline from the dotCMS CLI repository. So the first thing we're going to need to do is go to that repository, and then if you see here, we've got the actions ready for GitHub workflows here. If we just download this directory and put it in our dotCLI, we can then establish that integration for our dotCLI to directly through workflows communicate all of our files to GitHub at the same time as that we're committing them from our local environment to our server. Okay, so these are the files that I actually want to commit to my own repo. So you can see here that I've already committed that same workflows GitHub actions to my local repository. So now we're going to go to the documentation after that's done, and we're going to configure some things so that the workflows can be actually set up to run with the dotCLI. So you can see in the directions here, we need to go to our own repo, go to settings, then to actions, general, and then make sure that we have the workflow permissions set to read and write permissions. So let's go over here to our repo, go to settings and actions and general, and make sure our workflow permissions here are set to read and write permissions, and click save. Next, let's go back to our documentation, and we'll see we need to then go to secrets and variables, actions within that settings, and create a new variable called .API URL. And we need to set that to the API for the proper URL that we want to communicate with. So let's go back to our settings, secrets and variables, actions. So here I'm going to click on the variables tab and then add a new repository variable that is going to have the name .API URL, and it'll have the value of the server that we want to communicate with and a /API, right? So I'll add that variable. Now I've got that variable and the proper value for the API that I want to be able to communicate with. And now let's go back to the documentation and see that we've got to add a new secret in the other tab of the actions, secrets, and variables, and we need to name it .token. So we'll copy that, go back, and under secrets, we need to add a new repository secret. Here's our secret name. And what we paste here in the secret space is the API access token for the user that we want to be able to run the dotCLI with. So here I've just logged in another tab for my admin user. I'm going to request a new token, label it something, admin, and generate my new token. I will copy that token and paste it then inside that secret space and add the secret. Okay, so now we've configured the GitHub workflow actions for the dotCLI so that GitHub can take those actions and push the files for us to dotCMS server as well as our repo. So here we've already seeded using the dotCLI. Now if we wanted to just move files back and forth between dotCMS from our local, we could just use the dotCLI and the base dotCLS commands. You can use the cheat sheet here and move the files and content types, languages, and sites and manage them between the dotCMS server. But for true CI/CD pipeline where we want to use GitHub to be able to make these changes to both our dotCMS server and store all of the changes inside of our local repo in GitHub, then we want to be able to have GitHub actions that we've installed here control it for us so that there is just one set of commands that do both things, right? So now what we're going to do is add a new file to our local file system using Finder on my Mac, and then we're going to push those files simultaneously over to the dotCMS server and over to my GitHub repository at the same time. Now as you can see, I've already done a git add, git commit, and also a git push of all of the files just to save us some time. But now I'm going to just simply add a few files here to the files section. I'm going to go here to some local files that I have, and you can see here that we seeded everything with the dotCLI. I've already committed them so we wouldn't have to take so long. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop some new files here inside of my, if we look at it, inside of my image directory, inside of Grandview, you can see I've got different sites here. in my files directory, live means published. There is a working directory as well. And so you can add it as a published file, you can add it as a saved or working file, so you can add those there wherever you wish in whatever directory, and the matching directory should show up, and it will either be published or saved depending upon whether you put it in the live or working folder. So I've added those files inside of this directory, these layouts here. So now we want to not only take these files off of my local Finder or my local machine, we want to push them over the dotCMS server and to the GitHub repo so that they appear here under Files and Live and this particular site and Themes and Image. So we want to see them appear here at the same time with only one command. So we can do an ls and see that we've got those directories here in our inside of our main directory. I'm going to do a git add, which is going to then, if we do a git status, it's going to show us those files that we've added to that folder. Now we want to do a git commit and give it some sort of new layout files, give it some sort of message. So we've now staged that for a push. So then we now do our git push. So now I'm going to run the git push origin main command to then commit the files to not only GitHub but also to the dotCMS server. So we press enter, and then those files are actually moving over. We can, if we go to our actions, we should see new layout files right here actually submitting using our dotCLI workflow actions that we've added. And we just give that a minute and we should see those new files over here inside of the dotCMS browser. Okay, so if we just refresh now, we should see all of our layout files. If we look at mod date, we see all of those layout files here. And if we go back to our repository, our action has finished. And if we go to our code, we should see that also inside of files and live and the proper host, application, themes, images, we also see those layout files here taken over to GitHub and the dotCMS server at the same time via those GitHub actions that we installed. Okay, so now I'd like to show you what you can do actually before committing. So if you want to do a dry run, this wouldn't be through Git, but it would be through the dotCLI. You can actually perform a dry run and see how things are going to push over to the other server. Let's just say you've got a lot of things you're trying to push in multiple places, and you want to test that in a test push and then see what will actually transfer over through the dotCLI. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some more files. I am going to add them to that same directory that we did here before. So I'll just take these three and I will add them over to this image directory. You can see this services, online check, and this other JPEG. Now I'm going to step over here and just start off at the top. Always a good idea to do a dotCLI status so you can actually make sure that you are still logged in and what repo that you are logged into. And then I can do a dotCLI push dry run to go ahead and see those new things added to the system. And this is just checking and making sure it's picking up the new files and where it will add them. It could be adding changes to languages, sites, etc. So now if I look here, I've got those three files that I have committed to that live directory, right? And that way I can check via the dotCLI what is being added to every section of dotCMS before I actually make my commit. So just wanted to cover that in the dotCLI. That's something you can use to test your dry run. From here, if we're happy with that test, we can then proceed as we did before with the git add, the commit, and the push. Okay, so far we have added and updated objects inside of dotCMS and the GitHub repo using GitHub and the dotCLI workflow actions. But we haven't covered any delete options, and that is disabled by default. So how would you actually enable the workflow actions to delete objects from dotCMS if that was the desired behavior? So if we go here to the documentation, you'll see that right underneath the secret documentation that we used, you will see that you can actually define in a file that you have to add to the root of your workspace. You'd have to add a file called .env, and inside that you'd have to add .cli options. In there you would add the flags, so let me show those, and what they would need to look like to enable removing assets. This is what it would look like inside the file. Removing folders, removing sites. These flags will enable these types of objects to be removed whenever you use Git to then commit to the dotCMS server as well as the repo. But since it's considered dangerous behavior to automatically delete things from the dotCMS instance using Git, it's disabled by default, but you only have to add one file and add one or more of these options using this environmental variable name to your workspace, and then you would enable the deletion of dotCMS objects. So to conclude, we have discussed what is the dotCLI installation and configuration. We even changed a workspace. We synced files using the dotCLI. We actually even did a dry run using dotCLI commands. We configured the dotCLI to GitHub using workflow actions. Then through GitHub, we defined how we could add objects to both the dotCMS server and to the GitHub repo. And then I just defined the file and the environmental variable you would need to add to the root of your workspace to enable deletion as a default GitHub action. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope that you are now able to use the dotCMS.CLI for your CI/CD pipeline.